The Pensioner by William Caine. Miss Crewe was born in the year 1821. She received a sort of education, and at the age of 20 became the governess of a little girl 8 years old, called Martha Bond. She was Martha's governess for the next 10 years. Then Martha came out, and Miss Crewe went to be the governess of somebody else. Martha married Mr. William Harper. A year later she gave birth to a son, who was named Edward. This brings us to the year 1853. When Edward was 6, Miss Crewe came back to be his governess. 4 years later he went to school, and Miss Crewe went away to be the governess of somebody else. She was now 42 years old. 12 years passed, and Mrs. Harper died, recommending Miss Crewe to her husband's care, for Miss Crewe had recently been smitten by an incurable disease which made it impossible for her to be a governess any longer. Mr. Harper, who had passionately loved his wife, gave instructions to his solicitor to pay Miss Crewe the sum of £150 annually. He had some thoughts of buying her an annuity, but she seemed so ill that he didn't. Edward was now 22. In the year 1888, Mr. Harper died after a very short illness. He had expected Miss Crewe to die any day during the past 13 years, but since she hadn't, he thought it proper now to recommend her to Edward's care. This is how he did it. "That confounded old Crewe, Eddie. You'll have to see to her. Let her have her money as before, but for the Lord's sake don't go and buy her an annuity now. If you do, she'll die on your hands in a week." Shortly afterwards the old gentleman passed away. Edward was now 35. Miss Crewe was 67, and reported to be in an almost desperate state. Edward followed his father's advice. He bought no annuity for Miss Crewe. Her £150 continued to be paid each year into her bank, but by Edward, not by his late father's solicitors. Edward had his own ideas of managing the considerable fortune which he had inherited. These ideas were unsound. The first of them was that he should assume the entire direction of his own affairs. Accordingly, he instructed his solicitors to realize all the mortgages and railway stock and other admirable securities in which his money was invested, and hand over the cash to him. He then went in for the highest rate of interest which any one would promise him. The consequence was that, within 12 years, he was almost a poor man, his annual income having dwindled from about £3,000 to about £400. Though he was a fool, he was an honourable man, and so he continued to pay Miss Crewe her £150 each year. This left him about £250 for himself. The capital which his so reduced income represented was invested in a Mexican brewery in which he had implicit faith. Nevertheless, he began to think that he might do well were he to try to earn a little extra money. The only thing he could do was to paint, not at all well, in watercolors. He became the pupil, quite seriously, of a young artist whom he knew. He was now 47 years old, while Miss Crewe was 79. The year was 1900. To everybody's amazement, Edward soon began to make quite good progress in his painting. Yes, his pictures were not at all unpleasant little things. He sent one of them to the Academy. It was accepted. It was, as I live, sold for £10. Edward was an artist. Soon he was making between £30 and £40 a year. Then he was making over 100, then 200. Then the Mexican brewery failed, General Malefico having burned it to the ground for a lark. This happened in the spring of 1914, when Edward was 61 and Miss Crewe was 93. Edward, after paying her money to Miss Crewe, might flatter himself on the possibility of having some £50 a year for himself, that is to say, if his picture sales did not decline. A single man can, however, get along, more or less, on £50, more or less. Then the Great War broke out. It has been said that in the autumn of 1914 the old men came into their kingdom. As the fields of Britain were gradually stripped bare of their valid toilers, the fathers of each village assumed, at good wages, the burden of agriculture. From their offices the juniors departed or were torn. The senior clerks carried on desperately until the girls were introduced. No man was any longer too old at 40. Octogenarians could command a salary. The very cinemas were glad to dress up ancient fellows in uniform and post them on their doorsteps. Edward could do nothing but paint rather agreeable watercolors, and that was all. The market for his kind of work was shut. A patriotic nation was economizing in order to get 5% on the war loans. People were not giving inexpensive little watercolors away to one another as wedding gifts any longer. Only the painters of high reputation, whose work was regarded as a real investment, could dispose of their wares. Starvation stared Edward in the face, not only his own starvation, you understand, but Miss Crewe's, and Edward was a man of honor. He hated Miss Crewe intensely, but he had undertaken to provide for her, and provide for her he must, even if he failed to provide for himself. He wrapped some samples of his paintings in brown paper, and began to seek for a job among the wholesale stationers. He offered himself as one who was prepared to design Christmas cards and calendars and things of the kind. Adversity had sharpened his wits. Even the wholesale stationers were not turning white-headed men from their portals. To Edward was accorded the privilege of displaying the rather agreeable contents of his parcel. After he had unpacked it and packed it up again some 30 times, he was offered work. His pictures were really rather agreeable. It was piecework, and he was to do it off the premises, no matter where. By toiling day and night he might be able to earn as much as £4 a week. He went away and toiled. His employers were pleased with what, each Monday, he brought them. They did not offer to increase his remuneration, but they encouraged him to produce, and took practically everything he offered. Edward was very fortunate. During the first year of the war, he lived like a beast, worked like a slave, and earned exactly enough to keep his soul in his body and pay Miss Crewe her £150. During the second year of the war, he did it again. The fourth year of the war found him still alive and still punctual to his obligations towards Miss Crewe. Miss Crewe, however, found £150 no longer what it had been. Prices were rising in every direction. She wrote to Edward pointing this out and asking him if he couldn't see his way to increasing her allowance. She invoked the memory of his dear mother and father, added something about the happy hours that he and she had spent together in the dear old schoolroom, and signed herself his affectionately. Edward petitioned for an increase of pay. He pointed out to his firm of wholesale stationers that prices were rising in every direction. The firm, who knew when they had a marketable thing cheap, granted his petition. Henceforth Edward was able to earn £5 a week. He increased Miss Crewe's allowance by £50, and continued to live more like a beast than ever, for the price of paper and paints was soaring. He worked practically without ceasing, save to sleep, which he could not do, and to eat, which he could not afford. He was now 64, while Miss Crewe was rising 97. Edward had been ailing for a long time. On Armistice Day he struck work for an hour in order to walk about in the streets and share in the general rejoicing. He caught a severe cold, and the next day, instead of staying between his blankets he had no sheets he went up to the city with some designs which he had just completed. That night he was feverish. The next night he was delirious. The third night he was dead, and there was an end of him. He had, however, managed before he died, 2 days before, to send to Miss Crewe a money order for her quarter's allowance of £50. This had left him with precisely 4s. 2d. in the Post Office Savings Bank. He was, consequently, buried by the parish. Miss Crewe received her money. She was delighted to have it, and at once wrote to Edward her customary letter of grateful and affectionate thanks. She added in a postscript that if he could find it in his generous heart to let her have a still little more next quarter, it would be most acceptable, because every day seemed to make it harder and harder for her to get along. Edward was dead when this letter was delivered. Miss Crewe sent her money order to her bank, asking that it might be placed to her deposit account. This, she reminded the bank, would bring up the amount of her deposit to exactly £2,000. End of Story